We're still tracking the fallout of the Russian rebellion. Quite a story, that one. This weekend, Putin was on the edge of his seat. His country was dealing with a mutiny. And today it was NATO's turn to be on the edge. Its eastern flank is worried. That's because of the presence of this man, Wagner Chief Prigozhin. He's now in Belarus, and so are some of his Wagner forces. You see, when Prigozhin ended his mutiny, he brokered a deal with the Belarusian president, Alexander Lukashenko. He was promised a safe passage out of Russia and into Belarus, so that's where he is now. And his new location is making the NATO uneasy. To understand why, you must look at a map of Eastern Europe. You can see Belarus there. To its north are Lithuania and Latvia. And on the west, there's Poland. All of these are NATO states, and they're worried about Wagner on their borders.
Last Saturday, we all have seen the mutiny of the Wagner Group in Russia. If Wagner deploys its serial killers in Belarus, all neighboring countries face even greater danger of instability. Under such circumstances, deterrence and forward defense is a top priority.
We heard those questions of ladies and gentlemen here about the Wagner's group in Belarus and the presence of Mr. Prigozhin in Belarus. In my opinion, this is really serious and very concerning problem, and we have discussed, and we have to make some decisions, very strong decision. It, in my opinion, requires a very, very, very tough answer of NATO.
Those were the presidents of Lithuania and Poland. They say Wagner troops in Belarus spell trouble. They're worried about instability spilling over. So what is the NATO doing about it? Well, nothing yet, but it says its guards are up.
I think it's too early to make any final conclusions on the long-term consequences, including for NATO. But what we can say is that we are, of course, closely monitoring the developments, and we have already increased our readiness, our preparedness, and our military presence in the eastern part of the alliance.
That was the NATO Secretary General. He says the alliance is ready for any threat. But what is the threat, and how serious? Yes, the Wagner chief is in Belarus with some of his fighters, but as of now, they're most likely figuring out their own future, not planning an attack on Eastern Europe. You see, there's a lot of uncertainty, question marks on what will become of this mercenary group. They challenged Putin's power. Will he forget and forgive? Also, what happens to Wagner's global operations? This is a private army, as you would know. It has long been seen as an extension of Moscow's influence. It has operations in multiple countries: Syria, Libya, Mali, Central African Republic, Sudan. So clearly a large presence in West Asia and Africa, a presence that depends heavily on Moscow. Wagner benefits from the Russian government. Will they continue to work and fight for Russia? Will they continue their operations in all of these countries? As of now, the Kremlin says it will be business as usual. But for how long? How can a private army that challenged Russia continue to fight for Russia and be based in Belarus? I guess all of them are still trying to figure out how this works and what is the future. Wagner and Russia both need each other. Wagner depends on Moscow for arms and aid, and Moscow depends on it for influence, to keep a grip on troubled regions and to counter Western influence. So it's a fragile but important relationship. Putin cannot send Russian soldiers to Africa. He cannot replace the Wagner troops, at least not immediately. So for the foreseeable future, the troops may remain in West Asia and Africa. But does that mean that Prigozhin is forgiven? Before we try to answer that, listen to this soundbite. This is from an old interview of President Vladimir Putin.
Вы умеете прощать?
Да. Но не все.
А что невозможно простить?
Предательство.
So the anchor asks Putin, what is the one thing that he cannot forgive? And the Russian president says, betrayal. Prigozhin's mutiny was a betrayal by one of his closest aides. So it's unlikely to be forgotten or forgiven. A counterattack, a crackdown may not come today or tomorrow, but it will come. You've not heard the last of this. Now let's look at the other side of the world, East Asia, far away from the war in Europe but suffering its fallout. The world is divided, clear military camps and alliances have taken shape. NATO is fighting Russia, the US and China are in a Cold War, and East Asia is emerging as their battlefront. Every day brings new headlines featuring warships, military stunts and missiles. The latest one comes from Taiwan. 2 Russian warships sailed close to Taiwan, not Chinese, Russian warships. This was late last night. Taiwan's defense ministry was on high alert. They said, and I quote, "The National Army used joint intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance methods to grasp the dynamics of the Russian ships throughout the process and dispatched mission aircraft, ships and shore-mounted missile systems to closely monitor the response." We don't know just how close the Russian warships got to Taiwan. The ministry did not specify the distance, but they were close enough for Taiwan to put up its guard. And you must understand, Taiwan is no stranger to territorial incursions. Their neighbor is China, after all. And Beijing's aggression is almost routine. Let me show you something. This is the Taiwan Defense Ministry's Twitter feed. Every day it reports incursions by the Chinese Air Force and Navy. And despite this daily pressure, the Russian vessels found special mention because they escalate the already tense situation in East Asia. To understand this further, we need to zoom out, to look at the region as a whole. You have the no-limits partners on one side, that is Russia and China. They call themselves each other no-limits partners. They're joined by their old friend North Korea, a country that keeps testing ballistic missiles. It wants to develop nuclear weapons. It wants to threaten South Korea and Japan, and that's what it does. So this is one camp, China, Russia, North Korea. The other camp has some unlikely partners, Japan and South Korea. They've had a difficult history, but they're trying to forget it to secure their future. These 2 countries are under the American security umbrella. Washington has promised to defend Seoul and Tokyo, and together they keep holding military drills to unsettle Pyongyang. In response, North Korea fires even more missiles. And this is a dangerous spiral, a continuous cycle of showmanship. Here's the latest in that one. A US submarine is visiting South Korea. Not just any submarine, it's an Ohio-class warship, the largest class of submarines ever built for the US Navy, nuclear-powered and nuclear-armed. So nuclear weapons are being ferried about in East Asia, and of course, the US also promises to protect Taiwan from the Chinese, from Chinese military action. So add Taipei to their camp, and what do you get? A powder keg, ready to explode at the slightest provocation, and that's exactly what the Russian warship stunt near Taiwan is being called, a provocation. As if that wasn't enough, Russia seems to be doubling down. After all this drama, Moscow released footage of a military drill in the Sea of Japan. Russia's defense ministry chose this day, today, to release this video. It shows a corvette ship shooting down an anti-ship missile. The timing is suspect, and the build-up is dangerous. China versus Taiwan, North Korea versus South Korea and Japan, Russia versus American allies, America versus the Asian mainland. It's a mess, and a dangerous one at that. All sides need to do their bit to diffuse the tensions, because if they don't, one wrong move can send the world into another catastrophic war. And here's an example of that. What India shouldn't do: run its economy as per the whims of one leader. Xi Jinping's policies have driven China's economy into the ground. His Belt and Road Initiative led to high levels of debt. His obsession with zero COVID infected the economy. And his crackdowns on business leaders have driven away investors. The result is this: China is struggling, businesses are leaving, and Xi Jinping is trying to win them over. Today, the Chinese president made a pledge. He has promised to do right by foreign investors. Let me quote from what Xi Jinping has said. "We will continue to vigorously promote high-level opening up and better protect the rights and interests of foreign investors per the law." That's what Xi Jinping told New Zealand's Prime Minister. His name is Chris Hipkins. He's on an official visit to Beijing, and Xi told him that China is opening up again. Yesterday, the Chinese premier made a similar pitch. He tried to reassure investors. Beijing is trying very hard to reverse the slump, but it's not finding many takers, especially after today's revelations. Headlines like these: a major corruption scandal has come to light. Turns out local governments in China are cooking up their books. They're inflating their revenue through phony asset sales. A number of bogus deals have come to light. Some 70 regions, 70 regions are said to have falsified their records in China. They inflated their revenue by $12 billion. Let me explain how this happened. This is mainly about land deals. Now, usually regional governments sell land to private players, to property developers, who then build apartments or commercial properties. This is how it works, and this is normal practice. It's also a major source of revenue for local governments. But in recent months, China's real estate sector has hit a slump. So the demand for land has shrunk. Fewer developers are buying land from local governments. And so government revenue has taken a hit. And government officials have come under pressure because their books are not looking good. Some of them started cooking up land deals. They created phony buyers on paper. They falsified records and showed land sales on their books, which was all fake. In reality, some officials were just transferring ownership on paper, and the land in question was still in government control. It had not been sold. All they did was change the names to create an illusion of an actual purchase. Subsequently, government revenues were inflated. We are talking about fake revenues up to $12 billion. Why do you think they did this? Because Chinese officials are desperate. They face large debt obligations, and they don't have the money to repay those debts. These are government debts we are talking about, not personal debts. Local governments in China are buried under loans. At the end of last year, they owed more than $8 trillion. We've told you about this before, $8 trillion. This debt has gone out of control. Land sales would have helped, but there was no demand for land. So local governments could not raise money. In fact, land sales have been an essential source of their income. In 2021, they accounted for more than 40% of local government revenue, the sale of land. Last year, sales were down by 23%, and this market may not see a revival anytime soon. So with their back against the wall, local officials started cooking their books. And this is not limited to one or two cases. As many as 70 regions in China have inflated their revenues in this manner. Now, when stories like these come out, what message do they send to global investors? The Chinese economy is built on a foundation of deception. Their data was never reliable. Now, even their growth projections cannot be trusted. The heavy burden of debt will add to the mistrust. The phony records will diminish investor confidence. There was a time when global investors swore by China's growth story. That time is past. China is now turning into an example of what not to do. China's domestic problems seem never-ending, but that hasn't stopped it from playing the perfect host. Almost every week, a world leader is in Beijing. As we speak, the New Zealand Prime Minister is there. Soon it could be the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. They don't have a date yet, but Netanyahu has told US congressmen that he'll soon visit China. Some of them were in Jerusalem, and that's when he dropped the news. And now it's making headlines. Although this won't be his first visit to China. He's been there before, thrice. So this will be his fourth time in China as Prime Minister, but it's feeding a lot of chatter because A, America is Israel's biggest and closest partner. America and China are at odds, and Netanyahu's visit at a time like this sends a message. And B, he's not been to the US in this term yet, but he's talking about going to China, which makes you wonder what's going on between Netanyahu and Biden. You see, Benjamin Netanyahu was elected as Prime Minister last December. It's almost been 6 months, 180 days, but he's got no invite from the White House. These two countries, the US and Israel, are as close as they get. Israel is America's biggest ally in West Asia. America gives Israel billions in aid every year. It's been called an unbreakable bond. But it seems the Biden administration is not feeling it. They're keeping Netanyahu at an arm's length, not sending him an invite, and disagreeing with him publicly. This happened in March over Netanyahu's proposed judicial overhaul, a deeply unpopular move. It triggered the biggest protest in Israeli history. They were close to a civil war then. Among the protesters was the US president. He said Netanyahu should drop the plan.
They cannot continue down this road. And I've sort of made that clear. Hopefully, the Prime Minister will act in a way that he will try to work out some genuine compromise, but that remains to be seen.
Now, that's a public rebuke of a close ally. Obviously, it did not go down well with Israel, but Netanyahu played it down. He said friends sometimes do have disagreements. Listen to this.
You know, Israel and the United States have had their occasional differences, but I want to assure you that the alliance between the world's greatest democracy and a strong, proud, and independent democracy, Israel, in the heart of the Middle East, is unshakable. Nothing can change that.
You heard that. An unshakable alliance, he said. But are Israel and the US still as tight as they claim? Netanyahu is not new to politics. He's been prime minister for 15 years, Israel's longest-serving prime minister, in fact. He's dealt with multiple US presidents. He's navigated changing relations and equations. He did not share a great rapport with Barack Obama, and now he's getting a snub from Joe Biden. So he's going for the second best option, it seems, and that is China. He knows that US-China relations are at an all-time low. He also knows that his visit to China will make the Americans sit up. But that may not be his only purpose. He may want to achieve more than sending a message to Washington, D.C. Which brings us to the China-Israel relationship. First, the numbers. Trade was at more than $9 billion in the year 2012. By 2022, it almost touched $22 billion. China has been investing in Israel despite the roadblocks from the US, and there have been roadblocks. So both sides have been going slow. Plus, China's historic support to Palestine has posed problems for Tel Aviv. And yet, Netanyahu has persisted. In 2017, he called the Israel-China relationship a marriage made in heaven. Well, he said this about India too, so it makes you wonder if this is his favorite phrase. In his personal life, he's been married thrice, so do your math. Anyway, the question now is he going to China to consummate this marriage? He's an astute politician. The world around him is changing very fast, and China is playing a big role in that. Recently, Beijing brokered a peace deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia. For Israel, Iran is a sworn enemy and Saudi Arabia a coveted partner. Israel also wants to normalize ties with the Saudis. Some help from the Chinese would be welcome. So that's one reason. The second reason could be the Israel-Palestinian conflict, the holy grail of foreign policy, as it were. Every US president has tried and failed. Now China wants to mediate. This month, China hosted Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. So is it now Netanyahu's turn? Will he engage with China on the question of Palestine? Honestly, we don't know yet, but either way, China may be the winner here. The Israeli leader's visit sends a message, a strong message to the US. It also marks another interesting turn in the politics of West Asia. We'll be tracking it for you.